Good evening, everyone. My name is James Morris, and I'm presenting on tonight's live webinar for Club Soda Together. And I'd like to thank Laura and Yusi for the invitation. Really excited to be doing this webinar because something that's really interesting to me as a subject, both personally and professionally. So I want to kind of draw a bit on both my personal experience as well as kind of professional experience around the subject of moderate drinking, whether it's something that's achievable, who it may be achievable for, what are the main things that are worth considering, and yeah, those kind of things really. So just to talk briefly a bit about my background. I started drinking at about 14. I was a teenager in the 90s, which is a period that's kind of been described now as peak booze, in the sense that alcohol consumption has been rising heavily, or was rising heavily, particularly in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, and kind of peaked around 2004. And yeah, many of you know, kind of 90s was Alka-Pops and so on. That's when I was a teenager, and kind of it was very normal to kind of drink heavily, even underage, I suppose, and at that time certainly it was easy to get. So I began drinking kind of parks and whatnot about age 14, and by the time I got to university, I'd say I was drinking heavily as often as I could, quite large amounts, often 20 or 30 units in an evening, or, often days at a time. And that did lead to problems for me. So, about my second year of university, I began to develop some physical health problems. Sort of physical health problems, I don't want to go into details, they're not too pleasant really, but a degree of psychological addiction as well, whereby when I tried to change, I found it very difficult to do. I was thinking about drinking a lot of the time. So I went through a change process during kind of my time at university, and that was really difficult and quite an eye-opener, in the sense that a lot of my kind of friends or peers struggled to understand why I was changing my drinking, even if I'd explained some of the problems or reasons. A lot of them tried to persuade me not to, and I'm sure a lot of members can relate to people may be feeling threatened by you wanting to change your own drinking, because it may be hard to kind of mirror up to other people's drinking. I went through that process. After a couple of goes of kind of trying to moderate it and failing, not surprisingly, I think at that time, I eventually stopped drinking and didn't drink for about eight years throughout most of my 20s. And then I got to a point where, I've been working in the alcohol field in sort of some different roles for a while, and things just generally felt very different for me. I had gone to AA for a while during kind of my period of abstinence, or long period of abstinence, and I really liked it. I found that it was really great to get peer support and talk to people who understood why I'd kind of changed my drinking. But fundamentally, I never felt that I was alcoholic in that sense, kind of air quotes. Um, After 8 years of sobriety, I'd kind of been thinking for probably 3 or 4 years that I could probably drink again. I was in a very different place. Eventually decided to kind of give that a go very cautiously, with some kind of caveats, particularly that if it did appear to become a problem, or I found it difficult to moderate at all, or any of the kind of maybe obvious signs that it was becoming problematic, that I would again go back to abstinence or being alcohol free. And that was about 7 years ago, and I've been drinking in moderation ever since then, really, without too much difficulty, really, if I'm honest. yeah, I basically stick within the recommended guidelines. Yeah, drink maybe 2 or 3 times per week. Never really more than 2, 3 drinks at most, keeping track of units. Certainly never would get drunk or, yeah, approach alcohol in the way that I did previously. Um, so, so yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from a personal perspective. Um, but yeah, I've worked in the alcohol field for that period as well. Became very interested in it, partly because of the cultural change, cultural kind of experience and um, problems that I experienced in trying to kind of get support from my peer groups at that time. Um, yeah, my kind of professional experience, I've done a lot of work around brief interventions, training healthcare professionals around motivational interviewing techniques or kind of how to talk to people who may have drug or alcohol or other problems that they may not recognize or may not be motivated to change. I'm currently doing a PhD that looks around how beliefs about addiction influence people's chances for change. Um, so yeah, that's an area I'm particularly interested in as well, is the kind of idea of alcoholism and where it may be useful versus where it may not be useful. So that's something perhaps I'll talk about this evening. So I think that's kind of a good, hopefully a good overview of where I'm coming from, and I'm going to welcome any questions that come in. Thanks to those of you that have joined. Hi everybody, I've seen a few comments coming through. This is my first kind of Facebook Live webinar, so apologies for any kind of technical glitches or anything that I might not quite get a hang of. But yeah, if you've got any questions, please fire them in. And yeah, any questions or comments generally. I think one of the main issues that I think I've kind of been invited to talk about is the issue of moderating alcohol use versus maybe going alcohol free. And I think that's definitely a big issue that seems to come up a lot. And I know that Club Soda have created kind of a separate mindful drinking group, which I think specifically for people who have a moderate drinking goal rather than maybe trying to go alcohol free. And I think that's a really good move in the sense that yeah, I think people can. There is a lot of skepticism out there about moderate drinking goals, and I get that. Certainly, there are a lot of people who have difficult relationships with alcohol or past alcohol problems, and yeah, that moderate drinking goal or controlling drinking is going to be difficult or kind of not the best option for them. So yeah, I kind of do my best to talk about where I think or when I think maybe a controlled drinking goal or mindful drinking might be something worth trying versus when maybe alcohol free would be a better option. I mean, ultimately, it's for any individual to try and decide what's best for them. But certainly drawing on other people's experiences or hearing other people's experiences or looking at some of the research out there might be useful in helping someone decide. I think the most important thing or most important kind of predictor of whether sort of aiming for a moderate drinking goal might be successful or not is your kind of overall well-being and where you're at in life and so on. That if you're under a lot of pressure and stress and going through a really difficult time and have been drinking very heavily, then just moving straight into kind of different pattern of kind of mindful or moderate drinking is probably going to be quite difficult. That maybe some changes are going to be needed to kind of precede that successor moderate drinking goal. So for a lot of people that achieve moderate drinking goals, they usually do have periods of abstinence before that. ranging from, you know, anything from a couple of weeks or a month or so to many years, like myself. And certainly, yeah, there's an element of kind of scientific validity to the idea that the brain um, does learn behaviors, and those behaviors can become kind of reinforced over time, that the kind of neural pathways become reinforced the more you repeat something. And I think that's certainly true with addiction to a degree, that the longer you've been using an addictive substance or even engaging in an addictive behavior, the more your brain may be kind of developing pathways that make that behavior kind of reinforced or even automatic. Um, so, you know, it's kind of dual process theory of addiction. A lot of the broader stuff around Daniel Kahneman's decision making, or thinking fast and thinking slow, proposes that we have kind of two ways of thinking, and one is very automatic. So, you know, if someone throws a tennis ball at you and you go to catch it, that's an automatic process. Whereas someone asks you a kind of deep philosophical question, that's what we might call a more reflective thinking process. Um, and the more you repeat a behavior, the more it maybe becomes kind of automatized or automatic. And, you know, very commonly cited example is driving. So when you start off driving, learning to drive, it's a very reflective process. You've really got to think, oh, I've got to put the car into first gear, and I've got to look out for other cars. And then the more you drive, the more it becomes a kind of automatic process. Um, so a lot of people make comparison to kind of addiction or kind of drinking problems in relation to that kind of theory. I think the important thing is that you can unlearn or relearn different patterns. It just does take quite a bit of time and certainly commitment to maybe embed that behavior change, find out the ways that work for you, stick with it, and then kind of create those new uh, pathways in the brain that hopefully lead to a kind of healthier or better um, new behavior, becoming more kind of naturally embedded. And I think that over time, that those kind of things then become easier the more you do them. So just seeing a question here from Joe, thanks. She says, you said you had caveats when you decided to attempt moderation. Did you not worry once you'd started you might not have been able to stop, even with the best intentions? Yes, that's a great question. And certainly I was worried before I decided to attempt the kind of moderate drinking. And I think what I was more worried about was developing dependency, where I'd feel like I wanted to drink every day, probably more than I worried about kind of losing control when I was drinking. Because certainly for me, when I was drinking problematically, I would really drink a lot and kind of, if you like, lose control. Um, you know, go on kind of until I couldn't really drink anymore or whatever. I think that just when I started drinking again, I was in such a different place. And I think for me, a lot of the reasons behind my problematic drinking was, um, you know, when I was younger, I had quite a lot of, I'd say, issues around sort of anxiety, anger, maybe insecurity. And I felt that alcohol allowed me to, I wouldn't say maybe not allowed, but drinking made me feel like I was kind of getting rid of, or allowed me to channel those kind of negative emotions and feelings. And um, those were what really drove my problematic drinking. I think that when 8 years later I decided to try and drink again, I dealt with a lot of those issues. I was in a very different place, and I just felt like I didn't have that same negative energy. I've done some psychotherapy. I was just a lot happier in who I was and what I was doing and all those kind of things. So I definitely didn't feel I had that kind of fire in my belly that had drove my previous drinking problem. And I was probably more worried about just kind of regular drinking and it becoming a kind of creeping problem. Um, so yeah, I think the caveats were that if there were any signs that it became a problem, like the first few times that I drank, if I found that I did have a desire to keep going suddenly, then I would stop and reassess and say, yeah, okay, it's not going to be for me. Um, I think one of the most shocking or surprising things about um, when I did start drinking again was how sort of disappointing it was in a way, really. I think over my 8 year period of not drinking, I've become really happy in being a non-drinker and found ways to enjoy myself and, um, you know, be happy without needing to drink. And I certainly felt that by returning to drinking again, that wasn't going to massively change my life. But at the same time, I do think um, I did feel that there was something I was missing out on, and that I'd kind of almost romanticized drinking again. Um, so when I did start drinking again, it was almost a bit of a disappointment. It was, I just had one or two drinks, and uh, yeah, well, it's mildly relaxing and quite nice. But I think I was so focused on it and concerned about it being an issue that actually it was kind of hard just to enjoy it for what it was, just having a drink or whatever, in the way that a kind of normal drinker might just relax and have a drink or two. Um, so now the way that I see alcohol as a positive thing is um, something that I do associate with, the weekend, a glass of wine with a meal with my partner, or yeah, meeting up with some friends and being able to have a drink or two, and it not really being a big deal. At most, it's a kind of mild, relaxing, disinhibiting effect. But I'm really not using alcohol for um, the escapism or the venting or the channeling of kind of negative stuff in the way that I did when my drinking was problematic. So I think that's a really key thing, is that if you're going to attempt or trying to work out if kind of moderate drinking or mindful drinking is something that's going to be suitable for you, I think it's about being really honest about what are the reasons that you do want to drink, and if they're for kind of social elements of it, and you feel that you can kind of control it, or you can learn to control it, and you're kind of almost as happy without it, those are good signs. But if you still feel that you've got some of the issues that maybe feel drinking problematically has led to, or that those issues have maybe driven it, so if you have kind of anxiety problems, or maybe some stress issues that you feel alcohol in the short term helps you deal with, if you feel those issues are still there, then maybe it's not going to be such a great idea to kind of attempt moderate drinking rather than going alcohol free, unless you've kind of maybe had a good chance at trying to reduce your stress and find other ways to kind of look after yourself or deal with some of those issues. So I've seen a question from Laura which says, do you have specific rules about when, what, and how you will drink? Yeah, I think I've relaxed these a bit, not in the sense that, I think one of my concerns was that that over time, I'd kind of changed the boundaries a bit and, kid myself into thinking that that I was drinking without problems when maybe things had crept up or got worse. So certainly at the start, I had just essentially a rule that I would stick to within the guidelines. So, I mean, the recommended guidelines are quite interesting because there's quite a lot of controversy around those. And so in 2016, they were changed to 14 units per week for men and women. And prior to that, so when I started drinking again, it was like 3 to 4 units a day for men, 2 to 3 units a day for women, importantly with alcohol-free days as well. But yeah, that's kind of my main rule really, is that that I'm just more or less drinking within the recommended guidelines, and I'm not increasing or significantly increasing the risks to my health or well-being from that level of alcohol consumption. And that really is a world apart from how I was drinking before, where it was really just kind of drinking as much as I could to deliberately get as drunk as I could. So yeah, if I'm on holiday or something, I might have more than 2 or 3 days in the week where I would drink. But yeah, for the vast majority of weeks, it's never more than 2, 3 at most drinking days, and only 2 or 3 drinks. So that I'm not going over that weekly total really. And I think I think one of the issues with the recommended guidelines is that it's a bit of a one size fits all, and a lot of people kind of discount or reject the guidelines because they feel that it's too low, or it doesn't make any sense. But the evidence is that if you stick within the 14 units per week or thereabouts, you're very unlikely to experience any negative alcohol-related health effects. So yes, having some mild benefits from drinking without really experiencing any significant increased risks of health benefits seems kind of worthwhile for me, because I'm able to do that without problems or without worrying about having kind of any problems. And I think one of the issues is that a lot of people out there do drink a lot above the guidelines, and certainly as I used to. The problem is that the idea of the guidelines sort of implies that you have to stick within them. But of course, it doesn't really work like that, in the sense that if you're thinking about risk, then if you're drinking very high risk levels, then any reduction in your average amount of drinking is going to reduce your overall health risks. So a lot of people do experience benefits from even just cutting down a couple of drinks a week, or 5 or 10% of their consumption may have a significant benefit to them, and certainly reduce their longer term health risks. So for me, it's quite important to try and stick within those guidelines, but for other people, it may be important to try and just reduce what they're drinking, certainly as a first stage, or even just control their drinking so that it doesn't creep up over time. So I think that's one of the really important things, is to recognise that different people have different goals and have different circumstances. And certainly in the alcohol kind of treatment world, it's considered really important to try and work with what people's own goals are. And a lot of people start off with a moderation goal and end up going abstinent, and vice versa. Some people end up starting with an abstinence goal and end up finding kind of moderation may work for them further down the line. So yeah, everyone's different. I think another one of the key controversies is around this idea of alcoholism, and certainly the AA model, or anyone believing in alcoholism would certainly believe that having had a serious alcohol addiction, drinking again is never going to be a good idea. And I think for a lot of people that's true, that if you've had a very serious alcohol problem, the best thing really is to be abstinent. And a lot of people point out, why would it be worth the risk to drink again when alcohol's caused so many problems in their life? And I totally respect that and totally agree with that, that for a lot of people, particularly people who've had serious alcohol problems, that risk isn't worth taking. I think the problem with the kind of idea of alcoholism is that it creates a false a false distinction in population as, you know, there being two groups of people as kind of alcoholics and everybody else. And you know, I think that's a bit too narrow in the sense that there are people, you know, people including myself, who have had problematic drinking histories. You know, I was certainly psychologically dependent. I was never physically dependent on alcohol in the sense that I didn't wake up shaking and needing a drink, but certainly I had a degree of psychological dependence. So yeah, I don't think I was ever or would have ever maybe fit what many people believe to be alcoholic is. Even though I kind of went to AA for a bit, and you know, I took a lot of benefit from that in terms of the peer support and hearing other people's experiences in that period where I was aiming for abstinence. But yeah, I think there's a lot of people who do just change their drinking and wouldn't necessarily see that as recovery, even though you could consider it recovery in the sense that they maybe had a degree of alcohol dependence, or they had problems associated with their drinking, or it was difficult to cut down. Those might be signs of mild dependence or lower severity alcohol problems, and that it's a continuum or a spectrum. And where would you draw the line between someone who would qualify as an alcoholic and someone who wouldn't is probably, you know, it's kind of maybe metaphorically useful for some people to self-identify. Well, definitely useful for some people to identify as alcoholic and get that kind of support and be able to tell people that's why I don't drink, or not tell people, because of course stigma around alcohol problems is very important, well, very significant. And I think that's where we're kind of making progress in being able to talk about these things, that Club Soda and those kind of groups, these kind of groups are helping people to have a conversation and reach out to a broad pool of people who may use AA and may benefit from it, or may not, and feel like that it offers them a really great channel to talk about their drinking and talk to other people and try and work out whether they do want to cut down or moderate, or whether they do want to kind of get some professional help, or look at some other things, or look at some lifestyle issues, or any of those kind of things. So yeah, that's what I think is really good about these kind of groups, and really good to talk to other people. You know, having good social support is so important, particularly, you know, in difficult times. You know, life is challenging, it's stressful, and you know, in many ways drinking is a kind of almost natural response to kind of difficult life pressures. Of course, you know, that means that it can easily become problematic, and yeah, people often end up in problems, and that's so common where in society alcohol is very widely available and normalised, despite the fact that it is a potentially addictive, potentially very dangerous drug. So yeah, I think the more we kind of talk about it, and the more kind of reflecting on our own drinking as a kind of ongoing process, the better, the more awareness everyone can have, the earlier they can maybe identify potential problems. And I think that's key for anyone kind of maybe thinking about moderate drinking or mindful drinking, is, you know, the earlier you can identify and recognize your drinking may be becoming a bit of an issue, then the more chance maybe you have at that. So I think that's really important that we get the conversation out there, and yeah, kind of challenge the stigma around talking about alcohol and alcohol problems. And I think we're making some progress in there, even though it's slow. Maybe we're kind of following in the footsteps of tobacco or cigarettes, where, you know, going back to the 50s or whatever, it was just accepted as a normal thing to do, and people didn't really believe or think that it was a health problem. I think we're getting to a stage where, even though alcohol's different in the sense that there is a kind of low risk amount of drinking, whereas maybe don't have that with cigarettes. Any smoking is definitely dangerous. Um, yeah, more people are recognizing that, drinking above the guidelines or, heavily is something that we need to do more, to kind of recognize and support people who may be wanting to change that, whether it's cutting down or not drinking at all. And yeah, Club Soda are doing a great job in terms of the support network and championing the case for pubs as environments where you don't have to drink alcohol and have better options for non-alcoholic drinks or even low alcoholic drinks. Um, so perhaps we'll kind of wrap it up there unless there's any further questions. Um, yeah, I hope that's been kind of useful, and um, uh, yeah, post your comments down below and I'll try and come back and have a look at any further comments. Um, and yeah, I hope that's been useful. And I suppose just to recap, really, try and be honest with yourself if you're thinking about your drinking and whether abstinence or moderate drinking is going to be best for you. Then certainly a period of abstinence is a really good idea, possibly to give your body a break, but mainly particularly in terms of trying to help you assess how you do use alcohol, what you use alcohol for, what are your reasons behind it, and what would the pros and cons be in terms of considering drinking again, and if you do, what kind of rules are you going to set yourself, or kind of what are you going to do to kind of measure whether it is okay or problematic or not. Um, so yeah, I think certainly moderate drinking is possible for some people, but certainly for others or even many people, abstinence is always going to be the best bet. I'm not trying to say one's better than the other. I'm just trying to say that different things work for different people, and yeah, the support's out there through Club Soda, and yeah, kind of having that conversation and kind of reflecting back on yourself is kind of most important step, really. So good luck to anyone trying that, and thanks for joining me. Cheers.